June 28, 1944, 2:15 a.m., outskirts of Caen, Normandy. The rain wasn't falling so much as hammering, a cold, relentless French downpour that soaked uniforms, filled trenches, and turned every movement into a slow drag through mud. The night sky was smudged black, the horizon lit only by the distant flicker of artillery like dying candles. In the dim glow of a shuttered lantern, Lieutenant Robert Davies crouched over a mess of scrap metal, wet canvas, and coils of wire spread across a crate. He wasn't cleaning a rifle. He wasn't repairing a mortar. He was cramming sawdust into a piece of plumbing pipe. Around him, men from the 1st Battalion, Royal Engineers, huddled in the dugout, staring at the bizarre construction in disbelief. "Tell me that isn't supposed to explode," Sergeant Hales muttered. Davies didn't answer. His hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from the cold, as he worked a small funnel into the pipe and began sprinkling in gray powder. Corporal Finch snorted. "Look at him. Proper bloody handyman. Next he'll fix the toilets and blow up the Germans in one go." Small bursts of laughter followed, harsh and exhausted, the kind of humor soldiers use to stay sane. Even Captain Anson, the infantry liaison officer leaning against the trench wall, couldn't hide his smirk. "You really think that's going to do anything, Lieutenant? Because if it doesn't, we've got 78 men pinned down by 2 machine gun nests that have more ammunition than God." Davies didn't look up. "We're out of Mills bombs, sir." "Well, perhaps pray then," Anson shot back. Davies twisted a cap of copper wire closed, tight enough that his fingers went numb. "We don't need prayers," he said quietly. "We just need something that explodes." The captain scoffed and turned away, muttering about pipe dreams. The men laughed again, but this time the laughter felt thinner, cracked by anxiety. They all knew the truth. Their advance toward Caen had stalled, pinned down by entrenched MG-42 crews who could shred a full platoon in seconds. No grenades, no mortar left, outgunned in the dark and in the rain. Davies reached into a ration tin full of bicycle ball bearings, scavenged from a ruined workshop. The tiny steel spheres rattled like hail as he poured them into the pipe, packing them in around the powder. Gasps rippled through the trench. "What are those for?" someone asked. Davies tightened the end cap and looked up at the curious faces crowded around him. "Shrapnel," he replied, "but they'll think it's something much bigger." The room went silent, except for the rain drumming on the corrugated iron above. The only light flickered, glinting on the wet metal tube in his hands. It looked menacing, industrial, improvised, angry. A toy bomb? It suddenly didn't look like one. Davies held it up like a man presenting evidence. "This isn't pretty," he said, "but if it works, it'll look like an anti-tank charge, loud as hell." Captain Anson frowned, as though unsure whether to laugh again or step back. Davies only stared at the device, his voice low. "The Germans aren't afraid of us tonight. Let's give them something to panic about." Thunder rolled overhead. Or perhaps it was distant artillery. It was hard to tell. But in that moment, the pipe bomb's shadow stretched long across the muddy trench like a promise. And the promise wasn't small. Davies reached into his pocket and produced a single fragile fuse. He paused, attached it, and suddenly everyone stopped laughing. Because what if it worked? The rain eased into a mist by the time Davies crawled toward the ruined farmhouse where German machine gunners had dug in. The ground sucked at his boots, the mud greedy and deep, as if the earth wanted to keep him from getting any closer. Ahead, muzzle flashes ripped through the darkness, hot white, strobing in violent bursts from the stone windows. MG-42, the Hitler buzzsaw. Every burst sounded like the ripping of canvas, like the sky was being torn apart. Davies pressed himself flat against the cold ground just shy of the farmhouse. Beside him, Private Ellis clutched his Enfield like a lifeline, chest heaving from the sprint. "You sure this thing will go off?" Ellis whispered. "No," Davies said. "But at this range, if it doesn't, we won't feel embarrassment for long." Ellis let out a shaky laugh that died quickly. They were 10 meters from the nest, 10 meters from being shredded. Davies pulled the fuse wire between his fingers. Cold, wet, fragile. "Cover your ears," he warned. Ellis nodded and curled into himself. Davies struck the match against the stone. It sputtered, nearly died. The wetness fought the flame like a living thing. He shielded it with his hand, breath held. Then the fuse caught, hissing to life. He counted. 1, 2, 3. He hurled the pipe through the window, a metallic clang, a shout in German. Then the world split open. The explosion didn't sound like a grenade. It was deeper, a punch, a blast that seemed to rip from the earth itself. The farmhouse windows blew outward, spraying glass and dust like a geyser. A scream cut through the dark, raw, and panicked. Ellis gasped beside him. "Bloody hell! What was in that thing?" Davies didn't answer. He couldn't hear anything except the ringing, a high, whistling whine echoing inside his skull. Smoke spilled from the window, shattered stones showered to the ground, and beneath the ringing he heard something else. German voices, terrified, shouting over one another. Ellis frowned. "They think it's anti-tank?" Davies allowed himself one breath. "One down," he muttered. He signaled with his hand. 2 more engineers crawled forward, each cradling another pipe bomb. Captain Anson watched from the trench behind, frozen between disbelief and awe. This wasn't just working, it was scaring them. The Germans fired blindly now, terrified, throwing bursts into the dark. The muzzle flashes wavered with panic. Davies crept closer, another window, another nest. He lit the fuse with steady hands. "Second course," he whispered to himself. The pipe arced over a low wall. A German yelled. Then came the second blast, louder, sharper, as if the metal had screamed when it tore apart. Boom! The roof sagged. Screams turned to orders, frantic, broken orders. "Retreat! Pull back! Get out!" Ellis stared into the smoke, eyes wide. "What do we do now, sir?" Davies stood. The shock waves still vibrated through the stones beneath his boots. He wiped mud from his sleeve, his voice steady, almost calm. "We push forward," he said, "before they realize we've only got plumbing supplies." He turned, raised his hand in signal, and the entire line of British infantry began to advance, emboldened not by artillery, not by armor, but by improvised terror in a rain-soaked pipe. But the Germans weren't done running. They were preparing for something else, something no one expected. Because panic doesn't always make a man flee. Sometimes it makes him fight harder. The push toward the farmhouse should have been a triumph, a clean advance through smoke and broken masonry. Instead, as Davies and his men stepped into the courtyard, the sound that greeted them wasn't retreat. It was rifles being hurriedly reloaded. The Germans who survived weren't fleeing at all. They were digging in, desperate, convinced they were facing a new British weapon capable of blowing through stone like butter. Davies barely had time to speak before Ellis shouted, "Contact! Left window!" A burst of rifle fire cracked from a shattered doorway. Chips of stone spat into their faces. Men dove behind a collapsed wall as bullets chewed through the rubble. The Germans were no longer firing with confidence. They were fighting like cornered animals, devouring ammunition with wild, terrified bursts. Davies ducked as a shot cut through the air above his head. "They're scared stupid," Ellis yelled. "Good," Davies muttered, "but fear doesn't make them worse shots." A ricochet sparked off his boot. A private beside him, Miller, nearly dropped his rifle as his nerves jolted. "We need another bomb," someone shouted. Davies shook his head. "I only made 6. We've got 4 left. We'll need them for the bunker." "The what?" Miller choked. Davies pointed through the smoke. Beyond the courtyard, half buried under earth and sandbags, sat a reinforced bunker. Squat, ugly, windowless, its metal firing slit glowing faintly from muzzle flash. The real machine gun nest. The farmhouse was just a shield. Captain Anson, now crawling up beside them, stared at the bunker with dawning horror. "They fortified that position. That's not a nest. That's a damn pillbox. We'll lose half a company taking that." Davies looked at the satchel of pipe bombs at his side. 4 crude cylinders, 4 chances. "Give me 2 men," he said quietly. Anson blinked. "For what?" Davies answered without looking at him, eyes fixed on the bunker. "To make them believe we have dozens." Anson opened his mouth to protest, Then another burst from the bunker, hammered into the courtyard, pinning them down. The fear in the captain's eyes flickered into something else. Calculation, maybe respect. Finally, he nodded. Ellis scrambled to Davies's side. "So who's the other idiot?" A moment of silence. Then Miller sighed, resigned. "I hate pipes," he muttered and crawled forward. Davies cracked a grin, rare, thin, and sharp as the detonators he carried. They crawled from rubble to rubble, inches at a time, while the bunker spat steel over their heads. Each burst felt like a storm of nails ripping through the air. 15 meters, 12, 10. Sweat clung to Davies's face, even with the cold night pressing hard against his skin. The closer they got, the more the bunker loomed like a steel jaw waiting to bite. As they reached the last cover, a jagged block of concrete, Davies felt the ground tremble under another salvo. The MG inside screeched like a relentless saw. Ellis shouted over the gunfire, "They think we've got anti-tank charges, right? So just how big do they think they are?" Davies held a pipe bomb in his hand, its metal slick from rain and mud. His face lit briefly from the sparks of tracer fire. He wasn't smiling anymore. "They think we can take out a tank," he said, "so we'll make them believe we can take out an army." He pulled the fuse wire, and in that moment, inside that bunker, a terrified German officer shouted an order the British couldn't hear, an order born of pure panic. To prepare white flags, not to surrender, but to bargain. The fuse hissed like a venomous snake in Davies's fingers. He lobbed the pipe bomb low, skipping it against the mud and debris directly toward the pillbox firing slit. For a split second, nothing happened. Then, the device disappeared into the dark mouth of the bunker. Ellis slammed himself to the ground. Davies clenched every muscle in his body. Boom! The pillbox lurched, not destroyed, but rattled so violently that dirt cascaded off its roof like rain. The firing slit went dead silent. No return fire, no shouting, just a terrified, stunned void. Miller gaped. "What did we just do?" Davies stared through the smoke. "We didn't hit them with the bomb," he said. "We hit them with the fear of what's next." Within seconds, muffled shouting echoed inside the bunker. The tone was unmistakable. Panic, not command. Boots scuffed, metal clanged, and then a rectangle of white cloth emerged from the slit, trembling in the air like a ghost's hand. "Are they surrendering already?" Ellis whispered. Miller frowned. "No one gives up a fortified bunker from one blast, not unless—" He stopped mid-sentence because another white flag appeared, then another, then another. Through the smoke, 3 terrified German infantrymen stumbled out, rifles tossed aside, hands raised high. Their faces were pale, slick with sweat and grime. One shouted in broken English, "Stop! No more! We talk! We talk!" Davies blinked. "They're trying to negotiate," he muttered. The Germans weren't surrendering outright. They were begging for a truce, desperate to strike a deal before more of these anti-tank bombs arrived. Ellis whispered, almost in awe, "They think you've invented something that shouldn't exist." Another blast of fear rippled through the platoon inside. More boots pounded the floor. The hatches on the side of the bunker rattled. Davies could almost feel the panic radiating from the steel. And then came the real shock. The entire side door burst open, and a column of 30 Germans poured out with their hands over their heads, stumbling into the courtyard. Behind them, more still hesitated inside, peering out like prisoners waiting for execution. Miller's jaw hung open. Ellis shook his head slowly. "How many are in there?" The answer came as 40, then 50. Then men from beyond the bunker, troops hidden in trenches, foxholes, even a nearby tool shed, emerged, terrified of being late to surrender. 70 Germans crowded together under the rain, eyes wide, convinced the British held a miracle weapon capable of smashing fortifications like tin cans. Davies looked down at the remaining 3 pipe bombs in his satchel. Ugly, improvised, leaking sawdust and shrapnel. He let out a slow breath. "They're afraid of plumbing." Captain Anson approached cautiously, eyes sweeping over the mass of surrendered soldiers. His voice cracked between disbelief and embarrassment. What do we do with them? Davies handed the satchel to him, still heavy with 3 unused bombs. We take their weapons, he said, and we don't let anyone tell them what these really are. Anson stared at the bag like it contained nuclear secrets. The Germans didn't blink. They didn't breathe wrong. They were staring at the satchel, too, as if it held the wrath of the RAF in a tin can. But across the courtyard, someone else was watching. The surviving German officer, pale, bandaged, and shaking, pointed at the crude weapon and muttered something. Davies didn't understand German, but he recognized the word. Wunderwaffe. Wonder weapon. And the officer wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid they'd start using it everywhere. The rain slowed into a drifting mist as the first light of dawn bled into the sky. What hours before had been a battlefield now resembled a muddy field hospital crowded with exhausted captives. British infantry formed a loose perimeter, herding German prisoners with raised rifles, not with aggression, but with caution, as if the slightest mistake might cause the mysterious British bombs to rain down again. The satchel of pipe bombs sat on an overturned crate beside Davies like a holy relic. Men from the company passed by quietly, glancing at it with a mixture of respect and superstition, as though they weren't sure whether it was genius or madness that had turned a stalemate into a mass surrender. Captain Anson crouched beside it, wiping rainwater from his cap. "You realize," he murmured, "that for the rest of this campaign, they'll be terrified of ball bearings and plumbing pipes." Davies shrugged, wiping mud from his hands. "Let's hope they don't check any bicycles." Across the courtyard, medics tended to the wounded. German prisoners sat in tight clusters, whispering urgently to one another. Some argued, some prayed, some stared in haunted silence at the bomb satchel. One, an older sergeant with gray around his temples, kept repeating 2 brittle words, "Neue Ladung, neue Ladung, new charge, new charge." The psychological effect was complete. The bomb hadn't just exploded inside their bunker. It had detonated in their minds. Davies walked toward them, his uniform caked in mud, his boots squelching into the soaked earth. A young German soldier, barely 19, flinched and raised his hands higher, as though Davies might toss another pipe at them like a man throwing scraps to animals. Davies stopped. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said in English, though he doubted they understood. He pointed to himself and then to them. "No more fighting." The boy nodded rapidly, like a guilty child desperate to obey. Behind him, another prisoner asked quietly in halting English, "What is it made from? This British bomb?" Davies hesitated only a second. "Secret," he said. The boy nodded vigorously, relieved to be spared the truth. Back at the satchel, Ellis and Miller were retelling the story to a crowd of British infantrymen, acting out the blast with wild hand gestures. "You should have heard the bang," Ellis was saying, voice rising. "Thought my teeth were going to leave my mouth and join the explosion." Miller jabbed a finger toward Davies. "And him, he crawls up to the bunker like he's delivering a birthday present." Davies approached with a grim half-smile. "It wasn't elegant." "It doesn't need to be," Miller said. "It scared 70 men into surrendering." Ellis pointed at the satchel with a smirk. "What do we call them? Davies bombs? Pipe grenades? Plumber specials?" The crowd chuckled, tossing out ridiculous names. Caen crushers, thunder pipes, ball-bearing busters. Finally, someone shouted, "Davies drop-dead specials." The laughter rolled across the courtyard, not mocking this time. Admiring, exhausted laughter, the kind that shakes off fear like rain from a coat. Davies shook his head. "They're not special," he said quietly. "They were all we had." Captain Anson stepped up beside him, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "And that," he said, "is exactly what makes them special." It would have been a satisfying ending if war allowed such things. But as Davies looked south, toward Caen, the distant thunder of artillery reminded him, this was only one battle. Tomorrow they might run out of grenades again. Tomorrow, fear might not win a fight. Tomorrow, the enemy might not panic. Ellis followed Davies's gaze, somber now. What happens when they realize the truth? Ellis asked. Davies looked at the satchel of the improvised bombs. 3 left, meant for survival, not for legend. We make new ones, he said. But even as he spoke, he sensed the truth. Fear and ingenuity were his weapons now, and both came with a cost. They had to keep surprising the enemy, or the magic would die. And in the distance, the thunder grew louder. Because somewhere ahead, someone was building bunkers of their own, and they hadn't heard the rumors yet. Thanks for watching.